Welcome everyone to the March webinar for EMPA this year. This is our second one for the year, and again, it's a big one. So I'll just start with an acknowledgement of the First Nations people who are the custodians of the land where we're all meeting. We acknowledge and recognise the significance of our shared history, and we support the continued connections of First Nations people to country. I just wonder if you could all share where you're coming from, which First Nations area you live in, and also introduce yourselves and your organisations in the chat. If you've got some questions today, put them into the Q&A, which if you hover your cursor down at the bottom of the screen, that should come up and you can click on that. Our guest today is Joe Buffone, who is well known in emergency management circles around the world. He's the Deputy Coordinator General of Emergency Management and Response Group of the National Emergency Management Agency. Joe has previously held the position of Director General of Emergency Management Australia since October 2020. Having been with EMA since December 2016 and had held multiple roles within the organisation. As Deputy Coordinator General of NEMA, Joe is responsible for overseeing the Australian Government National Situation Room and coordination of the Australian Government Disaster Assistance, non-financial. Joe has more than 30 years' experience in security and disaster management and has held a number of key positions. This year, he was appointed to co-lead as co-lead of the Exotic Animal Diseases Preparedness Joint Interagency Task Force to undertake planning and preparedness across federal government jurisdictions and also the industry in response to possible incursion of foot and mouth disease or lumpy skin disease. Joe was deployed to Victoria in 2020 to establish and lead the Victorian Aged Care Response Centre to coordinate the response to COVID outbreaks in the aged care sector. Joe led the centre for 3 months until the situation was stabilised and transitioned to recovery. Joe has held several senior executive positions over the past 15 years, such as the Chief Officer of the Victorian Country Fire Authority, Deputy Emergency Management Commissioner of Victoria, Deputy Emergency Services Commissioner Victoria. So welcome, Joe. Thanks very much for coming today.
Thanks, Barbara, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on what part, because I know that I see that we've got some New Zealand colleagues online as well. So kia ora. And can I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the collective lands that we meet? I'm on Ngunnawal land, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders that may be on this call. So thanks for the opportunity, Barbara, to present at this, this webinar, and I'm looking forward to engaging and getting a range of questions as well. So we'll try to make it as interactive as possible.
Okay, thanks, Joe. So NEMA has been going now since September 1 last year, and you've been central to that transition. Can you just tell us what you're aiming to do and how the new agency format will get you there?
Yeah, thanks, Barbara. Really important part, as I said, 1st of September, brought together the National Resilience and Recovery Agency and brought together Emergency Management Australia. But I think the important thing is that this is about creating a new agency. It's creating a new agency that is focused on our risk reduction framework, so nationally, so that we're heavily focused on risk reduction. We're also looking at making sure that there's a shift from response and recovery to mitigation and preparedness. And within that, an important part is understanding and adapting to the impacts of climate change, which I think is really important. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't stop doing the response and recovery element of it. But we know, because that effectively is managing our residual risk. So you can't ignore that. And we're seeing more frequent, more intense, more prolonged, consecutive, concurrent and compounding events. And we've seen those in the last 4 years that start to actually impact on our system through that national capability lens as well. So for us, that's an important part of it. The other thing is we've got 4 strategic objectives, and I'll just go through them if I can quickly, Barbara. So the first one is leading, enabling and coordinating Australia's response, recovery, risk reduction and preparedness for disasters. So, a significant leadership role, remembering we are a federation and we cannot forget that and not forget around how we operate in that. So it's an important part around, having national leadership and collaborating very, very closely with states and territories. The second objective is empowering communities to make effective decisions based off the best evidence, intelligence and insights. Now, this to me is probably in one way, the biggest challenges, but the biggest opportunity. It's around how we use data, how we use evidence, how we use risk information to inform our decisions, both in the risk reduction space, but also in the response and recovery space. The better situational awareness that we have, the better decisions that we can actually undertake. The third one is strategic objective 3, building resilience by investing in people, projects, communities to reduce the impacts of natural hazards, including climate change. So climate change is front and center in our thinking, in the impacts, and in particular around climate change for me, or for NEMA as well, it's around adaptation. There's some big policy decisions and big policy actions that are underway, net zero emissions, changes to our energy systems, changes to how we do business. But in an emergency management context, how can we adapt? And there are a range of things that can be done. You're on mute.
God, you'd think after all these years we'd have that worked out, but the focus is a lot on community. So how are you going to achieve that level of community focus, given that it's such a big challenge for federal agencies across the board?
Yeah, absolutely. And it probably links in. I see that there was a question in the chat around, so what does national leadership actually mean in practice? And I think that this question sort of links to that. So without a doubt, everything that we do, whether it be in the policy setting, whether it be in the risk reduction setting, whether it be in the response, whether it be in the recovery, needs to have that community focus. It needs to be understanding what the impacts are locally and how we actually deliver. Now, there are governance systems in place. There's local government, there's the state government, there's the federal government. So within those layers, but our focus and our leadership has to be around how we bring those levels of government together, how we connect with non-government organisations. And an important part, and we've done a lot of work on this through COVID, is how we connect with the private sector, non-government organisations and the private sector. We underestimate the power of community and we underestimate the power of the private sector in how our society runs, our supply chains, how we actually deliver groceries, our power systems, our telecommunication systems, and all of our other essential elements that keep society going quite often are linked in through the private sector. So for us, it's about working within the federation, and this links back to that leadership question, and also leaning in but not taking over. There is no role, there is no governance. The Constitution does not empower the Commonwealth at any stage to to take over. But what it does do is it provides the ability for us to coordinate across Australian government, state and territory governments, local government, private sector, to get a really good outcome at the community level. And for me, I think it's important that we don't lose that focus. Everything that we do should be connected towards towards community outcomes. And that can be done even in focusing at the policy level in Canberra, basically.
So that community level focus is going to be fairly key in shifting to the risk reduction aim of the organisation?
Absolutely. So in line with and it's not just nationally, or we work off the Sendai framework, which was an international agreement, to reduce risk, and that cascades all the way down to community level. And so what we need to do is understand how we can communicate risk, I think, is an important part. Some of my learnings and some of my experience is when communities or even individuals can personalize the risk that they're facing within their communities, when communities can understand what that means directly to them, then I think that we get a different response from communities. I'll give you some examples. We've had significant flooding. Now, when you see some of the warnings that go out, and they might say major flooding, all right? So what does that mean when that gets translated on the ground at the community level? Does major flooding mean a whole lot of paddocks or retaining basins actually get impacted, or does it mean that communities are cut off, or does it mean, and I use a Victorian example, which Wangaratta, there's a Yogi Bear seesaw in a park that the community look at, and when it goes to certain levels, they know that flood is going to impact on certain areas within the community. So they know that when Yogi's up around the neck, then things are quite serious. And when Yogi disappears, that means that, the central business district is going to be impacted. The roads are going to be closed off. So again, how do we communicate that risk, and how do we translate that to real action and real understanding on the ground? And if there are community Yogi being an example, but if you say that at the steps of the GPO or at the steps of the police station, there's going to be a metre of water, well, then you have a real good appreciation around what those impacts are going to be.
So how far down the track are you in this new organisation in getting support for that to happen, and what might that look like with state agencies? How are we how will that appear in terms of community level communication and engagement?
Yeah, look, there's a lot of work that is continuing. It's not something brand new, Barbara, either. It's not like all of a sudden, we've had this epiphany to say, oh, this is what needs to happen. What the new agency does, though, it has brought together the capabilities that go along the whole continuum. When I talk about the continuum, I'm talking about as we start in the risk reduction element, then we start to move through the preparedness, then we start to go into, pre-event. And then obviously, once that we have some sort of impact, we've got the immediate response, we've got relief, we've got early recovery, then we transition into recovery, longer term recovery, and then we're back into the cycle, back into risk reduction, back into mitigation, back into preparedness, and then so this agency brings the capabilities so that we can actually operate across that continuum in one agency. That's the first thing. The second thing is there's significant investment. So there's a disaster ready fund, which is $200 million a year, which local government and states and territories can put up programs that then obviously will be considered against the criteria, and that's annually available. There's a range of other funding programs that can actually support that connection. But more importantly, it's back to this mindset. Our collective mindset and the point around adaptation, that we need to shift our thinking, not just on what we understand historically, but what we potentially need to deal with into the future. And so we are now working closer with states and territories, closer with non-government organisations. We run roundtables with NGOs so that we connect with them. We work closer with local government as well, so that we can actually work with them and understand what the unique elements of their communities are, what they need to prepare for. And a lot of it needs to be fundamentally understanding risk at that local level. If you don't understand risk, then in some ways you're not actually doing that evidence-based engagement and evidence-based information. Now, one thing I need to be clear about, it's not the intention of NEMA to be reaching in, not connected through state and territory governments and not connected through local governments. Because what we need to do, and probably one of our focus areas, is a better coordinated approach between levels of government and a better coordinated approach with non-government organisations and the private sector, so that you get the outcomes at community level. And I think that's a really important part. It's that connection and that coordination. And going back to that question around, leadership, national leadership, that's what I see as national leadership.
Right. Thanks, Joe. Going back to the mitigation message again, one of the problems that we've had in the Australian environment is that mitigation is very much a competitive funding. Mitigation and preparedness is sort of dependent on competitive funding. Can you see us moving away from that model if we're really getting serious about disaster risk reduction?
Well, I think let's look at it through a slightly different lens, Barbara. If you look at purely in the disaster management stream, yes, there is a degree of competitive, sort of bidding for grants, etc. But the mitigation model is bigger than just the disaster management stream. So we need to look at it through a broader lens. So when you're building new infrastructure, for example, well, then at that point, you need to be putting disaster mitigation in place at that point. You need to be looking at what is the future looking like from a climate change. The benchmark, and please don't hold this as the absolute, but in many areas, the 1 in 100 is the benchmark for a lot of mitigation, levels. Well, we've seen that exceed many, many, many times over the last, the last 2 years, because La Nina coming in and having, 3 repetitive La Ninas in a row, and we've seen the impacts of that. So future design becomes critical. And then we see future design and engineering solutions that then rolls into energy consumption. We see building standards. We see, if temperatures are going to rise. I mean, I still find it fascinating in Australia, we still build houses without eaves. Well, if we have a look at what our ancestors built, they built a house with a big veranda with great big eaves that literally covered the veranda. There's probably a reason for that, probably because the sun gets really, really hot, and that means that place stays a hell of a lot cooler. So then we've shifted away from that, and I think that we'll have trends shifting back to that. But the same thing is in around the designs of our cities. We know that our cities are going to be, more populated. So we're going to have bigger cities, although that trend changed a little bit with COVID. But in the main, cities or, central areas are still a significant focus. So how we bed that into, design of cities. And the other big one, which we've been tackling for years, and there's a genuine friction point, which is land use planning. So land use planning is a critical element to mitigation, and it doesn't just sit in the disaster mitigation space. But there is a rub point then around affordable housing, around access to infrastructure and all of those. But if we're going to deal and if we're going to adapt to climate change, they're the sorts of big P policy matters that we need to tackle, and we are. We've got engagement with the insurance companies, which is something that is a critical part of mitigation as well, is how we leverage off insurance, make it affordable, but also send market signals around other investments in areas that are too high risk, in particular from natural hazards. So from our perspective, and again, back to that I'll keep going back to this national leadership thing, it's around bringing those elements together to deal with it across the whole spectrum of civil society.
Thanks, Joe. Veronica Foster's got a good question here. Frankston City Emergency Management has focused on preparedness for our most at-risk residents. Will NEMA be considering a work by University of Sydney and probably research widely to inform internal business?
Absolutely, Veronica, and hello too. Absolutely, I think going back to our strategic objective around evidence-based, I think it's really, really important for us to get academia involved, understand some of the research. But can I really highlight one other thing, Barbara? And we've seen this just recently. All disasters magnify existing vulnerabilities in society, right? And you have a look at, I'll use Fitzroy Crossing as an example in Western Australia. And I personally went there to engage with the elders in Fitzroy Crossing. So you already had a community that was a remote Indigenous community that was vulnerable for a whole range of different, reasons, including people with special needs, people with disabilities, people that have drug and alcohol dependency, and a whole range of other things, which are in all elements of our society. But once that you get hit by a disaster, those elements get magnified like tenfold. So I'm a very strong believer, and NEMA is very much focused on this, understanding those vulnerabilities, making sure that the system actually focuses on those that need the most help, in particular during a disaster, but also more importantly, in preparation. So we engage with NDIS around how do we get our people with disabilities, better prepared. We engage with the National Indigenous Agency Australia to work with First Nations people to make sure that, remote Indigenous communities can be better prepared, but then also when they actually do get impacted, what they do. I mean, we've had, remote Indigenous communities impacted in Western Australia and in Northern Territory in the last 2 months. But it's not only that, all the research, and back to Veronica's question, shows us that people with vulnerabilities, people with special needs, people with disabilities are overrepresented in those that are mostly impacted, but then take longer to recover from disasters. So in some ways, the system has to reset as well to make sure that that focus is on. Go back to Black Saturday. One of the recommendations was around how do you identify those most vulnerable within your community? And that comes back to your first question, though, Barbara, is, how do we engage at the community level? Well, in some ways, the best people to know where their vulnerable people are the community themselves. And I've seen it. I can give you examples of even the most recent flooding in Eugowra. The community rescued a man in a wheelchair that had water up to his chest, and they ended up towing a ute behind a fire truck and put him in the ute to get him out of that. Now, that's quite a dramatic story, but a real story, but that's the community actually helping itself. And I might be a little bit cheeky here and probably say, you know what? Sometimes we look at some of the most recent events where community responded and then say, oh, the system failed. I'd actually argue that there's a bit of resilience in that when communities actually respond. And I'd actually argue one step even further, that the communities are the first responders. The communities will be it doesn't matter where you are, when you have a disaster, the communities, those directly affected are those that will have to respond before any emergency services get there.
So, Joe, that research is part of your overall intelligence gathering. I'd imagine there's been a massive amount of that being done since September 1. Do you have any real new insights for communicators and community engagement people from that effort?
So I'll step back a couple of things. So our focus in particular to meet our strategic objective number 2, we have built for the first time a national joint common operating picture. Now it's still in its infancy. And what that means is through a single portal, states and territories have access to it. Australian government has access to it, shows all of the events, weather systems, etc., that are occurring nationally. The system is built off of a Esri ArcGIS, and sorry for the technical language, but it's a platform that we can continue to build on to then do analytics on it. So to understand that. And so that's a significant part of where we're heading. And we've got a 4-year maturity program of that system, that my vision would be that then industry has access to it. And then in the perfect world, we will end up with the community having access to it. Now, I'm just going to have to move my computer a bit because I disconnected it, and the power is starting to just get a little bit running out, and I don't want to have a blackout. So just excuse me for a moment. This is Emergency Management 101 on the run with contingency coming into play. So there we go. So that's one element. But the question you asked specifically about communicators, I think that it is our communication people are such a critical element to our emergency management system in every way. And I think some of it is about language that we use. The communicators need to actually communicate in a simple language, in a language that our community can understand. I think about how we communicate even amongst ourselves, amongst emergency management community. We have our own language. We have our own acronyms, and sometimes we go, oh yeah, that makes total sense, until you engage with probably 90% of the community, and they're sort of looking at it going, what does that mean? Even the fact that we talk about phases, right? We're in a preparedness phase. We're in a we're in a response phase. We're in a relief phase. We're in a recovery phase. Now we're into long-term recovery. Communities don't think in that language. They've been impacted. They're responding. They're dealing with it. And they just move, and they move in different phases as well, and in different timelines, depending on how they're impacted, depending on what their resources are, and depending on what agency they have as well. So I think how we communicate, is really, really important. And there's another really fundamental one, and it sort of goes back to September 11, and this has really stuck with me. So I call it the Giuliani model, but it's probably been improved a little bit. But the classic thing of, what do we know? What are we doing about it? What do we know? What we're doing about it, and what we want you to do about it, in some ways, is 3 simple steps, around communication. The other thing is around, even in our warnings, communicating in a way that people, first of all, can understand the risk or the threat, and then with some indicators around what action they need to take. And I think in some ways, and it's challenging because we've got a lot of information that we're trying to get out there, but the simpler that we can communicate, the better. The other thing that I touched on is what I spoke about at the start. If we can communicate in a way where people can connect to that message and either localize it or personalize it, then you get a different response to it. But if they can't actually connect to the messaging, then it's just noise. It's another piece of noise amongst a very, very, we're in the information age. So how we actually understand that. The other thing is social media, and actually how we monitor and understand community and community sentiment through social media. Now, there's misinformation, disinformation, there's a whole range of other sort of elements, but I'm still a strong believer, and I've been in this game for quite a while, and I can remember when we first started talking about monitoring social media, and I can tell you there was resistance within the emergency management system going, how could you possibly listen or monitor social media? There's no authority associated with that. And I can tell you, if you don't do that, you will be hours behind what's actually going on, because our formal systems cannot keep up. They cannot keep up with the information age, the digital age, social media. And I'd actually argue that there is, if you get 1,000 people that are saying a similar thing, or even photos, or there's so many elements of information that you distill and analyze, and if you're not using social media, you will always be behind the curve on understanding the situation, being able to communicate, and being able to send warnings.
So Amanda Lamont is interested in the importance of conservation, biodiversity and the nature base in emergency management. And she just wanted to know what NEMA's involvement in that aspect of it will be.
So, g'day, Amanda. Nice to hear from you, and a great question, of course. Like NEMA's, as I said, NEMA's looking at the whole spectrum, and biodiversity is a critical part of our system. And one of the other big shifts, and I probably should have highlighted this, and we've done a lot of work, in particular through the National Coordination Mechanism, is around consequences. So, the likelihood is nearly irrelevant to us, but actually managing the consequences of an event that looks at first, second, third, fourth order consequences. And in the work that we do, in particular in the appreciation and planning work that we do, we start to look at the consequences, and biodiversity and the environment is part of that. The only thing is, I would say, Amanda, and you and I have had many conversations around this particular topic as well, is we've still got to make sure that the human factor, is a focus, life, reducing harm, maintaining public trust. And then, of course, linked into that is the whole ecosystem around biodiversity, etc. Now, in relation to the mitigation and preparedness element of it, there's departments for environment, and there are a whole range of other Commonwealth departments that have the lead. And that takes me back to right up the start around the question on leadership. NEMA's role is to engage across federal agencies and federal departments to make sure that these sorts of elements are connected into the system, because biodiversity and our whole ecosystem is as important as our adaptation to climate change, so that we actually have a whole sustainable system that actually makes our environment better, which then leads into mitigation. So, it's that whole connectivity and interconnectivity. One of the things that I was going to touch on, and it was actually covered off by, sorry, I'll just pull out my slide, that was around the UN IPCC report, Climate Change in 2022. And first of all, it spoke about complex, compound and cascading risks, and that climate change impacts the risk are becoming increasingly complex and more difficult to manage, and multiple climate hazards will occur simultaneously. Multiple climatic and non-climatic risks will interact. So it's that interaction point that creates second, third, fourth order consequences that sometimes we don't even think about. And I'll give you an example, not so much on the biodiversity space, but when flooding occurred in South Australia and it impacted on North-South Rail Link, East-West Rail Link, Stewart Highway, pretty much shut down the supply chains into Western Australia and into Northern Territory. But a really important part is that supply chain had an impact on a particular product that was used for water purification and sewage treatment. So if we couldn't have sorted that out, we would have had an impact where untreated sewage was going to have to be released into the environment, having that flow-on impact of impacts on biodiversity, impacts on the environment. So this is where the system is all connected, but a lot more complex.
We'll go now to the topic of shared responsibility. So it's a great sort of sentiment, but we often see that agencies are reluctant to actually take that final step. Mark Duckworth is asking how NEMA will sort of support communities to have agency. And Amanda's asked another question that relates to that. Communities tend to step back when response agencies arrive. How do we help them lean in and actually appreciate that they can have that agency?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question, and g'day, Mark, as well. It's not as simple a question as it seems, and because there's a range of considerations when we have to work with communities. The first thing is for them to maintain agency, which I think is absolutely critical. And this is my point when, the narrative of a failed system because community had to respond to rescue people, for example, right? And then we say, well, that's a failed system. Well, I would argue that that's actually community sharing some of that responsibility. So for me, well, let me start with Mark's question first. So Mark, what NEMA's intention is again, through resetting the risk reduction framework, through investing in how we engage through that national lens and resilience building nationally, is around how we actually work through the system to support communities to have agency and to understand shared responsibility. The other side to that is what I'd also spoken about. If they understand risk and they can engage with risk and personalize risk, either at a social level or at an individual level, then they will have a different appreciation of how they engage. The point around emergency services is it's a change factor of sharing power. And this is one of the challenges of sharing power with community, so that when the emergency services come in, they actually come in to work with community, not to community. And, there is a bit of a fine line there, because if community is actually, there are elements where they need that direct intervention, but very, very quickly you have to move to supporting rather than, sort of direct intervention. And I think that there's an art to that. And so to me, where we have to start is in some of the core training for emergency services, because the system is built on a command and control model, which is somebody's in trouble, we've got to go in, we've got to take over, we've got to rescue them, we've got to support them. So that's more of a victim approach as opposed to a partnership approach where you go, well, in actual fact, we're going to go in, we're going to support them, we're going to connect with them, and we're going to give them a hand up, which is a very, very different model. And it actually needs different skill sets as well. That's the other thing. And I've been involved. I've been a first responder. I've been to communities where we've gone in, and I always draw from a comment that was made by communities in Black Saturday. So we're talking 14 years ago. We were okay until help came. Mm-hmm. Right? And I don't say that lightly, because what had happened is the community had actually started to organise itself, and the emergency services came in, all with great goodwill, but then went in with this intervention, command and control, and effectively disempowered that community. And we can't disempower community. And the other thing is, if we do that right, it means that their recovery is faster and better.
Sally Perry had a point about that tendency for many agencies to trample over community-led efforts. And you just talked about training as a way of affecting some of that cultural change. Are there other things, and you've probably been involved in a lot of cultural change over your experience. I wonder what other things agencies can do, and where NEMA might involve itself in helping that process along.
Yeah, great question. And Barbara, I think it's actually at every level. It's in the policy space, so you get your policies right. I mean, even the point I made around, some of our policies do not address some of the fundamentals of gender, children, domestic violence, and this is, I'm talking in the disaster space. Then we've got people with special needs, people with disabilities, and then just, empowering community or not disempowering community. So I think in the policy space, in our plans, in our exercising, so exercising is a critical part of our capability building. And the other thing is actually working directly with community. One of the most powerful exercises I ever participated in, and I was with a response agency then, was Warrandyte. where, they did a community exercise. It was community-led, it was community facilitated, and the emergency services were actually a participant. So you talk about a bit of a shift there. And I can tell you, I had a bit of trepidation sitting up on the stage there as a senior emergency service leader going, where is this going to go? The classic thing, oh, well, stone him sort of thing. And I can tell you it did not occur. It did not occur because we were engaged, we were transparent, we were open, and they understood the complexities of the system. And what happened out of that is that the community accepted some of the, the challenges within the system, and the next day started taking local actions to be better prepared and to respond. And that was very much around fire. So for me, it's in every aspect of our system, all the way up from, frameworks, policies, plans, training, exercising, but also that's not just within the formal system, it's actually with communities as well. And I think if we can do that, we can get that shift.
So that example of the community towing a ute behind the truck has been brought up by Ben Merritt as admirable, but if it was done by an agency, it would have been in breach of many workplace health and safety rules, and we saw SES wasn't able to respond because of the situation that they were facing. Yet communities did respond in the Northern New South Wales floods. Given that commentary, are there discussions with the community about what the limitations of our response as organisations are?
I don't think that there are enough just dialogue with communities. But Barbara, I think there's a different element to that too. I think that we need to put, you spoke about how do we make the system in some ways more resilient. And I'd actually even argue that we even need to look at legislation and policy that actually protects both community members, Good Samaritans, and also agencies that then engage with communities in that environment. Because what happens in those situations, and I use this as an example, if you get run over, like if I get run over out the front of my building here in Canberra today when I step out because it's raining, the biggest challenge will be convergence of emergency services and others, right? There'll be that many ambulances and fire trucks and police vehicles that, there'll be more of an issue around managing that. As you get an event that becomes so big that becomes beyond that local level and our resources are stretched, then that same model doesn't apply. And you'll never have the resources, the classic thing to send a fire truck to every house or send an SES flood boat to every house. So the system has to be able to expand and surge to deal with this change in service delivery model, but then there has to be protections, both for agencies and also for community. And some legislation, and I'm a Victorian and I spent most of my career in Victoria, there are elements of Victoria's legislation that allows effectively volunteers to be signed up immediately to give them legal protections to undertake some of those elements of it, and also to protect in relation to, occupational health and safety, etc. Because novel events need novel ideas and novel approaches to actually deal with it and to deal with the complexity. Because if not, you will be paralyzed by your own system.
Yeah. Okay, you talked earlier about some of the vulnerable groups that aren't sort of appearing in the legislative policy landscape. What about cold communities? Faye Bendrops has got a question about how we better systematically communicate with communities that are not having an English-speaking background.
Yeah, great question. And it's been one of the challenges that we've been, as long as again I've been in this industry, we've been looking at cold communities, but it's probably becoming even more important. Australia is so multicultural now. Like, when you have a look at the most recent events, and we saw some examples where, agencies absolutely would have been doing their absolute best and doing a great job. But then again, if you don't have an appreciation of that local community and what the sort of differences are in terms of language, understanding of language, English not as a first language, those sorts of things, then it's back to my other point around the simplicity of the message and the message that they can connect with and act on. So it is a mix of, there's so many variables that you have to consider. But if you understand community beforehand, so if you have in your preparedness, in your planning, and for example, that in, different aspects or different communities, there are a particular cohort, then you can actually set your systems up. The challenge is, though, you're never going to get everybody. And back to that shared responsibility, when I was the project lead for Emergency Alert post Black Saturday, and, we weren't sure around what the saturation would be and what the success rate of text messages would be. But I had the view that the vast majority, if you can reach the vast majority, and then if they then share that, so if you get one in, 50% of the impacted community, and then they share that, you should be able to get saturation and get information and get communication through. So that goes back to that shared responsibility, but also a system that is cognizant of the variables within a community, so that you actually do have to have something in language. Going back to First Nations, there are communities, First Nation communities, that do not speak English as a first language. All right, so we communicate in English, and we probably communicate in our emergency management language. Well, how is that received at the community end? So it has to then effectively be translated. But then, as I said, a way is if you get it into the community, and then they take on the responsibility to share that, to communicate that, then I think that that's a way to go into the future.
Anthony Clark's question is about the friction we see sometimes around the role of political leaders in response and recovery stages.
Thanks, Anthony.
And there are some examples where it's done well and some not so well. What role do you see our political leaders playing at a national, state and local level, and when to get involved and when not to?
Well, anybody that's heard me do any presentations will say politics is part of our business. And sorry, let me be clear, political leaders are part of our business, and we have to be aware of the politics. Our job is not to play in the politics, but we need to be aware, and our political leaders are actually representing their constituents. And it's something that I've actually had to shift in my thinking, is that they will be representing their constituents, and therefore, as they're being either briefed where community members are engaging, they will then reach in to the system, to the political system as they understand it, to get some action. So for me, what our job is again, make sure that we've got the best information that we have available. Make sure our situational awareness is is the best it can possibly be. Make sure that we have evidence-based around what we're doing and why we're doing, and share information. And then the other thing is brief, and be open to politicians engaging very, very early. It's not unique to Australia. It's actually globally. Have a look around the world, any press conference, and you'll see political leaders engaging very, very early, and they're on the ground very, very early. So Anthony, you're 100% correct. And you've got some really good experience just recently around, how that operates. The other thing is that the relationship between the Commonwealth, the state, and the local, sort of politicians, there's a very strong connection in that. And our job is to make sure that we actually engage to ensure that the politicians can do their job as best they can, as well as us dealing with the event itself. So it is a new paradigm, but a paradigm that we need to work with, rather than, probably have the view of, why are politicians engaging? They're part of our system. We're in a democracy, and the political leaders, our elected leaders, are engaged with their communities, probably more than we've seen ever before, especially in disasters.
Emma Ward's wondering about ways we can use AI tools, and she specifically mentions ChatGPT. Is NEMA thinking about this?
Absolutely. As part of our National Joint Common Operating Picture, machine learning, AI tools around analytics, because if you can do that, if you can automate elements of it, there's a key thing about using AI though. You have to make sure that any decision points that have an impact on people has to have a human element to it. There has to be checks and balances. And I think that you would see most recently, there's been some examples, high profile examples with Royal Commissions running around AI that does not have a human involved in critical decision points. So the AI can help in terms of providing information, dealing with big data, but you have to have that human point. But I'm an absolute believer that, we need to start leaning in on AI, and using that in our systems. Again, back to our strategic objective number 2, using data, using information, using evidence to make decisions and make them quickly. That's the other thing. Our decision timeframes are compressed more than ever. You don't have, the sort of timeframes that we had before, especially when you've got more frequent, more intense, consecutive, concurrent events happening nationally. You don't have the luxury of sort of, we've dealt with one, we'll now deal with another in a linear fashion. It doesn't work that way.
Chris Ainsworth is asking about the training picture with the new format of the organisation.
A really good question. And to be honest, I think that training is probably a gap in our system at the moment. We used to have the Australian Institute of Emergency Management. We don't have that anymore. We're looking at how we actually close that gap. Part of it is through ADA, but it doesn't, but the gap is around the vocational training element of emergency management in its broader context, in particular at the local government level. So I actually think that that's a strategic point that we are looking at. We don't have a solution at the moment, but definitely on the radar. The other thing is NEMA as a new organisation has got significant focus on establishing its internal vocational training program to make sure that its officials can be as well trained as possible within the emergency management profession. Because if not, then we're going to be asking people to do tasks that are more than a generalist policy task. So that's a significant focus. But without a doubt, we need to definitely look at nationally how we actually reinvigorate EM training.
And from Peter Anliker, would there be any decentralisation of NEMA staff, and what sort of numbers, if that's going to be the approach?
Great question, but we've actually got our budget happening today, and it's totally dependent on the outcomes of that, which we'll find out later today. And then we are looking at what that looks like. So totally dependent on what the funding model looks like for NEMA. Regardless of where that lands, the approach is reaching into states and territories, engaging with states and territories and local government. How we go about that will depend on what our physical footprint is. But, there are a number of ways to do it, and we need to get better at using, technology, engagement tools, and being able to communicate, at all levels. So some of the principles that we're talking about here, NEMA has to actually apply as an agency. And
we'd also be really interested to know what sort of collaboration you've been doing with other national agencies around all of this.
A lot of collaboration. As I said, we've been engaging with every state and territory agency in some shape or form. And when I talk about state and territory agency, I'm not just talking about the emergency services. We're talking about the recovery bodies, we're talking about the policy setting, we're talking about, first ministers, So absolutely engaging. We've been engaging with non-government organisations as well. So looking at round tables so that we can, have that better connection. We're also looking at obviously across the Australian government. So making sure that we are really well connected across the Australian government. The other thing is there's some other elements occurring. There's review of the disaster funding arrangements nationally. There's a review of governance arrangements nationally. So they're critical parts of, of the system. There's a review of the Australian Government Crisis Management Framework that was ticked off last week. So there's a number of elements to actually refresh and have a look at how our arrangements work. But there's one key point, Barbara. It's very much about future looking. And I often say there's a reason why the windscreen is bigger than the rear vision mirror, right? So, it's good. You need to check. You need to make sure that, you're not, you learn from history, but climate change has taught us, and I'd even argue some of our catastrophic work, we look at historical events and then we model our system on that. And then when we see the change, we're not ready for the change. We're not prepared for the change, and we haven't geared our system up for the change. So I think that that's an important part of our work nationally as well. So we've got a busy agenda.
Yeah. And probably the last question for the day, it's around Melanie Taylor's inquiry, and it links back to the cultural change we were talking about earlier, but hers is from the community perspective. How do we change the broader community expectations around what agencies can achieve and services stepping in to protect them?
Gee, good question, Mel. It's in some ways it's a really fine line, because not just emergency services, but all services want to be able to portray that the investment, there's an investment element in this, that the investment in that service is returning a community safety outcome. All right. So there's that element of it. The other part, though, I go back to my understanding risk, understanding capability, and understanding that there are times when, emergency services can only do so much, and community as the first responder, need to be prepared. And our New Zealand colleagues, they're big on, self-sustainment for 72 hours. That will go so far until people have to be lifted off their roofs because they've got no water, no sewerage, no power, and they're they're not in the water, but they're isolated and they don't have any services. So there's a range of different things that we need to look at around, community, getting community out if they're going to be isolated, and then also around them organising themselves. I'll also be a little bit provocative as well, that the emergency service model might need to change, where as the system gets stretched, that they actually have more of a community leadership role rather than a responding role. So they actually go in with a multidisciplinary agency and actually play a community leadership role, right, which effectively gives you a force multiplier. So instead of having the cavalry come forward, you actually send in a capability that helps the community, one, be connected through communications, two, be connected into the emergency management system formally, but then coordinates them and provides leadership so that they can actually respond. So a very, very, very different way of thinking to the more protectionist sort of model where we go, oh, the emergency services will come in. I'll go back to Black Saturday. It took Black Saturday for us, and I can put my hand up to say, us fire services, to acknowledge that when a fire got to 4,000 kilowatts of energy, you could not suppress it head on. So you could not pull it up. So what do you do then? What do you do then? If you can't pull up that hazard, you've got to then start working on warnings. You've got to start working on evacuation. You've got to start working on community making safety decisions for themselves. And I used to joke sometimes when I was doing emergency alert, and in particular working with the fire services, if I could have squirted warnings out of a fire hose, it would have been a really easy job, right? But you can't, and you're dealing with humans, and everybody takes in information a different way. So being as simple as we can with key messages and using every element of our system and society is around, and effectively to me, that's what resilience building is about.
Thank you very much, Joe. There's lots to be excited about. Thanks, everyone. And thank you to everyone who provided questions. Brilliant conversation.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Barbara.